Morning, Trinidad and Tobago. There's an issue that needs to be cleared up and clarified immediately in relation to the powers and duties of the Executive Council of the Tobago House of Assembly. I have seen in the media and in other places calls for the person who holds the office of Chief Secretary, Mr. Ansel Dennis, to stop using the motor vehicle and to stop exercising the powers of Chief Secretary and to stop living in the house of the Chief Secretary, the official residence. And I must say that I totally deprecate those calls, because when one looks at the law and the legislation, and we must always be guided by the law, we must always be guided by the legislation, it is clear under Section 34 of the Tobago House of Assembly Act, that's Act number 40 of 1996, it is very clear that it says the Executive Council shall be responsible for carrying out the functions of the Assembly, and the Chief Secretary may, for that purpose, undertake or assign to a Secretary responsibility for any such function. So that's the basic provision that sets out the role of the Executive Council. And in 33, it says, Section 33 says, the Executive Council shall comprise of the Chief Secretary, the Deputy Chief Secretary, and such other secretaries as may be appointed. So the Executive Council, which is the Chief Secretary, the Deputy Chief Secretary, and the other secretaries, that Executive Council is preserved by Section 34(4). Under Section 34(4), it says, the Executive Council shall continue to discharge its functions during any period that the Assembly stands dissolved. So in other words, during this time when the Assembly stands dissolved, the Executive Council is still valid, effective, and functioning. So the Chief Secretary still holds his position and his office, so also does the Deputy Chief Secretary, so also do the secretaries. So any call for the Chief Secretary to stop living in the house, stop using the car, or stop exercising his functions as Chief Secretary is totally wrong. It appears to fly in the face of the clear provisions of the law, and I think that that ought to be clarified and cleared up, so therefore that misconception is not out there amongst the public. The law further goes on to clarify the position in Section 36, where it says the Chief Secretary shall vacate his office where for any reason other than a dissolution of the Assembly he ceases to be a member, or immediately before the administering of the oath under Section 8 to himself if he is re-elected or to his successor. So therefore, in those circumstances, the Chief Secretary remains in office until the oath is administered either to himself if he's reappointed or to a new Chief Secretary if that occurs. So let's be very clear on that. We look at Section 33, we look at Section 34, and we look at Section 36 for the guidance. And it is very clear that the Chief Secretary remains in office and he's fully entitled to all the perks, privileges, benefits of the office. He's entitled to exercise the powers of Chief Secretary during this time, and so also the Deputy Chief Secretary and the other secretaries. In fact, Section 36 also goes on at subsection 3 to say a secretary other than the Chief Secretary or the Deputy Chief Secretary shall vacate his office. And the relevant section that we are looking at is where, for any reason other than a dissolution of the Assembly, he ceases to be a member. So in other words, if you cease to be a member for a reason other than dissolution. So in other words, the Assembly is dissolved, so therefore in those circumstances, you don't immediately or automatically vacate the office. It's important for this to be cleared up and clarified for the public of Trinidad and Tobago, so any prior misconceptions must be cleared up and clarified for persons who thought that there is no Chief Secretary or there's no Deputy Chief Secretary. There is a Chief Secretary and there is a Deputy Chief Secretary, and there are the secretaries. They all continue in office until there's the reappointment or appointment of new persons. So we must be very clear on that. There's absolutely no need for the Chief Secretary to stop using the vehicle, stop living in the house, or stop exercising the powers of Chief Secretary, because the law is very clear that for any reason other than a dissolution of the assembly, if he ceases to be a member, but the point is, he has ceased to be a member by the dissolution. So therefore, in those circumstances, he continues in office and the Chief Secretary remains there until immediately before the administering of the oath to either himself, if he's reappointed, or to his successor. So that point needs to be clarified for all of Trinidad and Tobago, particularly for Tobagoanians and for the prospective persons who will be forming the new assembly. Thank you.